Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. Hope you all had a great Thanksgiving. Today's about democracy in America, and is it working? Democracy in America is naturally always a hot topic in politics, and it should be. And oftentimes you hear about it being under attack, usually by candidates trying to win elections or activists trying to get the policies they support implemented. But while there is a lot of heavily biased rhetoric about the ways we save our country, our freedoms are fragile and we must strive to protect them. And that requires knowing what the core of the American system of government is about. However, there are some misunderstandings and debate about what the American system of government is and what it's supposed to be. Not only that, but there are some concerning beliefs from many Americans that it is not functioning the way it is supposed to. So the concern is not only about civic knowledge about the American style of government, but how Americans perceive its efficacy. So what exactly is democracy? And is the United States a democracy? Where do we see democracy in this country? What are the ideals of democracy? How have Americans felt about democracy in America in the past, and how do they feel about it now? And lastly, how do we uphold democracy in America in the face of threats? All this and more is on tap for today's episode, so let's get right into it. First of all, what exactly is democracy? It's a word that's thrown around a lot. Lots of words get thrown around a lot in politics, regardless of their meaning. So before we define democracy, we need to talk about how we determine what system of government any country can be called in the first place. So you have to think of things like, how is the government structured? Is there a president like here in the United States, or is there a prime minister like in the UK? Are there monarchs? Is there a dictator? What other positions are there? Are there multiple branches of government, like how in the US there are three? There's the executive, legislative, and judicial. Or is it really just one branch and the other two are basically at the whims of the other, typically the executive? Are there national, state, and local governments? How subnational do those governments get? How local and sublocal do governments get? For example, you have towns and cities, but how do you get below that, like special districts or universities or HOAs? Another question to think about, what is, or rather, where is power vested in? Is it with the people? Is it with the government? Is it with the government by consent of the people? Is it a mix? Is power more centralized or spread out across subnational units like states over here, provinces in Canada? Russia has what are called oblasts. There's cantons in, I think it's Switzerland, departments in France, which are more or less the same kind of thing, but they just have some little differences, not necessarily little, sometimes big differences in how exactly they operate. Is power invested or vested in the people, but only certain people? So is it by class, where it's only the rich? Is it by race, so the predominant race in a country? Is it by gender, where only men can vote? All those are things to think about where power is vested in, to think about how exactly or what exactly the system of government is. And then there's also, what is the role of citizens? So do they just elect government officials? Which officials do they decide on, and which ones are appointed? Because over here in the US, for example, there's a lot of officials that are just appointed rather than voted on, especially in the federal government, and then states vary considerably in what offices can be voted on. Do citizens get to directly participate on any legislation, like with ballot measures, which we'll talk about in a little bit? How much of a role do socioeconomic characteristics play in power distribution? So is it ruled by nobility or the masses, or is it somewhere in between? Or is it only by the most elite of the elite? So not just wealthy, you have to have a certain echelon of wealth. How much impact do the most wealthy have on government, even if it's technically not ruled by the nobility or by the rich? Do they have an outsized influence on what government does? And then lastly, how do decisions ultimately get made? So if the people vote on legislation, or even if the government does, is it just a simple majority rule in all circumstances? What power does the minority have in the face of the majority? So those are some of the biggest questions to think about when you're talking about the system of government. And then you can get even more granular in defining systems of government. So, for example, there are multiple types of democracies, and some of the more basic subgroups or subtypes of democracies is you got a direct democracy where people have the authority to deliberate and make decisions on legislation themselves. And then there's also representative democracy, which is where people elect government officials to make decisions on legislation. And then there are a bunch of other types that get really technical and specific, depending on how technical you want to be. Identifying governments is not always objective or concrete, nor are they always mutually exclusive. For example, if we support democracy but not the party in power, our bias often leads us to say that this country is not a democracy or that it's not acting democratically. We let our partisan or ideological biases affect how we perceive democracy in government. We're going to talk about that, of course, some more later on. Words like fascist, socialist, anarchist, communist, these are words that get thrown around all the time with reckless abandon, and a lot of times not they are kind of used as euphemisms for undemocratic, or just basically this is not something I agree with, so therefore it's this. Just like how we talk about something's not democratic a lot of times purely based on whether we like that person who's making that action. And then there's some difference in perspectives on how much power the wealthy have and should have in this country. So, what exactly is a democracy? So, the literal definition of the Greek word that democracy comes from means rule by the people. Beyond that, that's where the exact definition of democracy can differ. So, how the rule of the people works can vary because of the aforementioned considerations that we just talked about. But typically, in a more quote unquote pure democracy, the people have considerable direct decision making power. So, not just they elect people to make their decisions for them, which is representative democracy, but they have a lot of direct power on decisions as well. You get into these technical definitions versus the ideals of democracy. So even if you technically don't have a democracy, there are still a lot of ideals that come from democracies that can and should be upheld. And we're going to talk about some more of those ideals shortly, but just as a few, for example, we have the freedom of speech and religion and the right to personal property. But how we value those can differ from democracy to democracy. So, one of the big questions here is the American system of government a democracy? You have probably heard some people say that it is not a democracy. This partly depends on how technical, and some people might say pedantic, that you want to get. To some extent, it is a matter of technical definitions versus ideals. So, do we functionally have a democracy, or is it just aspects of a democracy that you find in this country, even without actually being a democracy? And so, if you want to get super technical and strict, the very technical definition of the American system of government, we are not a democracy. Because democracy, for several reasons. One, democracy often implies majority rule all the time, or at least most of the time, that everybody gets an equal voice in government, which does not happen in every case. Some people will point to the Electoral College, for example, as a non-democratic aspect. It's an indirect election of the president. It's actually done through the states, even though the states are largely based on people's vote. But you can win without the majority of the popular vote as president. Equal U.S. Senate representation is not democratic because no matter how big your state is, each state gets 2 U.S. senators. It's the U.S. House that is based on the population. Then there's also constitutional limits on what can be done, so it's not just straight up democracy all the time. Many offices are appointed and not elected. So you could point to a whole bunch of different reasons why we're technically not a democracy. And the people also have limited ability to directly make decisions on policy. Now, yes, you have a bit more of a representative democracy because we have other people making our decisions, but even then we have limited ability to directly make decisions on policy because there's still a lot of officials that are not elected and they have a lot of impact on policy. And if you read the Federalist Papers and other works by the framers of the Constitution and founding fathers, there was some apprehension about too much democracy because they were afraid of primarily what they called a tyranny of the majority, where the majority would just run roughshod over the minority and the minority can't say anything and the majority can do whatever it wants. So a lot of founding fathers, not all of them, but not all of the framers of the Constitution were a little wary of quote unquote true democracy. But it's kind of pedantic to be like, oh, we're not a democracy. Yeah, we're not, but a lot of times people just say that just to be a little bit pretentious and know it all. And I'm going to admit I've been guilty of that in the past. So, yes, we're not actually a democracy. By pure definition, what we are is a constitutional federal republic. So take each of those words. Constitutional, we have a constitution that is the supreme law of the U.S., and it provides the framework for how government is structured and limits on that government's power. And then the constituent states also have their own constitutions, but the U.S. Constitution is the ultimate authority. So whatever the state constitution says, as long as it's not contradicting directly the U.S. Constitution, it's fine. If it is contradicting the U.S. Constitution at any point, it is not fine. It is unconstitutional. The federal part comes from the fact that power is shared between the national or central government and the state governments. So federal and national are two words that are often used interchangeably, and for the most part, they mean the same thing. But to be fully accurate, we are a federal government, not a national. Because national indicates that it's a unitary state where states and provinces hold little to no authority. States in the U.S. actually have a lot of power, and that is a point of contention. How much power do they have and should they have? And then the federal power is derived in large part from the states. It's where we get the term federalism from, as there are some powers that are specific to the federal government, there are some specific to the states, and then there are some powers shared by both the federal and state governments. And then the republic comes from the fact that while the people hold power, they elect representatives to exercise that power. So, for example, we have a Congress for the federal government, and we have state legislatures for the states. However, of course, we do see aspects and ideals of democracy at work, which is the vast majority of what we are talking about today. So, where exactly do we see this democracy in America? Regardless of our definition of democracy, there are plenty of examples of its ideals at work in America. Unfortunately, though, America has not always lived up to its democratic ideals, namely from the fact that suffrage, or the right to vote, used to be highly restricted, and in ways that some people don't realize. Even early in the Republic's history, only white propertied males could vote. So not even every white guy could voice their opinion about government. Now, those property restrictions were the first really big one to go in regards to restricting the right to vote. So even though property requirements would be phased out, racial minorities still couldn't vote. And different racial minorities got the right to vote at different times. The Eighth Amendment in 1870 granted the right to vote to some, but not all racial minorities, ones that were considered citizens of the U.S. So at that point, obviously, African Americans, but the ones like those of Asian descent didn't get it at that point. Native Americans didn't get it at that point. They didn't get it until later, and I forget which episode of the podcast it is, but I actually talk about that in an earlier episode about basically the history of voting rights in this country. And then even when racial minorities were still getting the right to vote, women didn't have the right to vote until the 18th century in 1920, though there were some states that had already allowed them to vote, even if it was only for certain offices before that point. So that is actually why Wyoming is called the Equality State, because they were the first state to grant women the right to vote. We have generally become more democratic over time. Now, how democratic we are is still somewhat subjective. Some activists and politicians argue that laws, for example, that prevent ex-felons from restoring their right to vote are anti-democratic because they did their time, they're out. Why are we delaying the restoration of their right to vote? And then some people will say, well, they harmed society. This is their penance, even if they're out of jail. And there are even a couple of states that, I believe Vermont's one, and I think there's one other one, that let people currently in jail vote. So is that democratic? Another one to consider is, are term limits anti-democratic? Now, term limits tend to be a pretty popular sentiment, but there are one of the big opposing arguments to term limits is people say they're anti-democratic because you're basically telling voters that even if they want to support this longtime elected official, they can't anymore because, at least in the minds of people who are against term limits, they have this arbitrary limit placed on them. For example, 8 years or 12 years or 16 years. So they'll say that it's actually anti-democratic to have term limits because you're not letting people decide to vote for that official. Now, some people will come back and say, well, actually, the fact that they are still in office is anti-democratic because they have a lot more resources at their disposal and are able to use the incumbency advantage. And that gets into a whole other can of worms. We've actually talked about term limits before several times on this podcast, including early on. So I don't want to get too much into it, but I want to bring it up in the context of whether U.S. democracy is working as it should, because that is an argument that is had, is that term limits are not a democratic institution. But then some people say it is democratic. So that's for you to decide. But clear-cut examples of democracy in America, just some of them to talk about, is ballot measures. This is probably, no, it's not necessarily the most obvious example. I mean, voting in general is the most obvious example of democratic ideals, but ballot measures are the most direct way for voters to make their voice heard. Now, how these ballot measures work differs by state. For example, the basic types of ballot measures, you have citizen-initiated measures, you have legislatively referred initiatives, and then ones that I'll just say are more miscellaneous. Get to them in a second. 26 states allow for some form of citizen-initiated measures. So not only do citizens vote on a policy to implement in their state statutes or their constitutional amendments or their city's charter, they also can propose that policy in these 26 states. Now, they don't all work the same way in terms of what kinds of initiatives you can bring up and how exactly you have to construct those initiatives. Like, for example, some of them have single subject rules where only one subject can be discussed in that initiative. So if it's marijuana or if it's guns, you can't have marijuana and guns in the same initiative if it's a single subject rule. But there is some, not leeway, but there is some interpretation to be had about what exactly constitutes a single subject. But then you also have the legislatively referred initiatives, and every state except Delaware has those. So these are ones where instead of citizens proposing an initiative or a ballot measure that gets on the ballot, it's actually the state legislature that says, this is what we support. Now you guys get to decide. So then they put it to the voters that way. Every state except Delaware requires that for these legislatively referred measures. I don't know why Delaware is the odd one out in that regard, but they are. Other unique circumstances, this miscellaneous category I mentioned a little bit ago, you have automatic ballot referrals, which are, so these are ones that are not, you don't have to specifically go through a petition process to get this amendment put on the ballot. This is one that automatically comes up every 10, 15, maybe a different time frame, years, depending on the state. So you don't have to actually do anything to make it get on the ballot. You also have ones that are commission referred. So if there's a unique commission, like there's a constitutional revision commission from in Florida. I think Arizona has specifically a tax related commission that can put forth ballot measures. You have certain other commissions like that, several other states. And then you have conventions where, like, if there's a state constitutional convention, they can refer initiatives to or ballot measures to the ballot. So those are the three big categories. And then you also have a lot of local measures that are voted on each year as well. So things like bonds or raising a half-cent sales tax, typically for schools, but it might be for something else as well. All sorts of other things that a local measure could be about. So they might work fairly similarly to the state level ballot measures, but they are, of course, for a specific locality like a county or a city. And then how they can pass differs as well. So typically, ballot measures only need a simple majority, which is a 50% plus one vote. And that's when you talk about democracy, you typically think just simple majority. But Florida and Illinois require 60% for citizen-initiated constitutional amendments. Colorado needs 55%, and then Arizona needs 60% for tax-related measures specifically. Now, when you talk about democracy, there's another debate to be had. Does democracy have to be a simple majority? Is 60% anti-democratic? Because if you have 55% of people say, for example, or 53%, you have a majority of people saying that, but it's not a simple majority rule. You have to have a super majority, like 60%. So is that anti-democratic? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. That's another thing for you to decide. Another thing that is democratic is, of course, how we vote on state level officials. So some states elect more state level officials than others do. Alaska, for example, only has governor and lieutenant governor that is voted on. They have other state executives, but they're appointed. North Carolina, meanwhile, I think has like 10 state executives that are voted on in different years. But some states also might have elected state Supreme Court judges or intermediate appellate court judges. Other states, they are simply appointed, or they have a unique way to elect them where, like, they're not necessarily chosen through an election at the beginning. They might be appointed by the governor, but then to retain them, the voters then choose whether to retain them or to say, bye-bye, get out of here. So obviously it's more democratic to have more people voted on, but which state executives, which state level judges should be voted on as a requirement of democracy? Is it necessarily anti-democratic to say we can't vote on state Supreme Court judges? Some people will say it is anti-democratic. Some people will say it's not. Some people will say it's probably anti-democratic, but these are positions not necessarily for state Supreme Court, but maybe like an education commissioner, for example. They'll say maybe it's anti-democratic, but these are things that other people need to decide on, so government officials, and that's a whole other discussion. But you also have, in the vast majority of elections, candidates only need a plurality of the vote to win. So that simply just means they have the highest percentage of the vote compared to the other candidates. However, there are certain cases in some states where candidates need a majority. If they don't win a majority of the votes, they got to go to a runoff between the top two vote getters in a couple of weeks. And there are some places like California, for example, where it doesn't matter how much of the vote you get, you have to win, or you have to go to a general. They have it where it's a top two primary, where top two vote getters in the primary go on to the general election. And no matter how many votes or what percentage of the vote you got in that primary, if you got 99% of them, you go to the general election. So how democratic or anti-democratic are those stipulations of needing a runoff? Is ranked choice voting more democratic than a normal plurality or normal majority vote. So, where you have a whole bunch of candidates and you rank them first place, choice, second place, or second preference, third preference, fourth preference, however many voters they are. And then you go through that rigmarole until you get to a majority of people choosing a specific candidate. Is that inherently more democratic than a simple plurality vote or a majority vote? A lot of questions that we have to ask ourselves. But I think it would behoove us right now to then get further into the actual ideals of democracy. So, by technical definition, no, we are not a democracy, but we clearly have democratic aspects at work. So, different democracies have different ideals they specifically look to protect, or they have similar ideals, but they have different levels of protection and specific laws and regulations. So, for example, in a country that actually values democracy, not one that pretends that its elections mean anything. Many countries value the freedom, or many of these countries value the freedom of speech, but they do it to different degrees. It's not quite the same level as it is in the US. There might be some restrictions there. Like, for example, in Germany, for example, you have a lot of regulations as to Nazi imagery and what it can be used for, and predominantly can only be used for educational purposes. You don't quite have that in the US, where, for example, the KKK is not just only restricted to educational purposes. Unfortunately, they can still assemble as a group and do their thing as long as they're not actually threatening people. And it's one of those things where, yes, obviously, this is something we don't want them to do, and ideally, they wouldn't be doing it, but freedom of speech requires that we let them do that as long as they're not infringing on other people's rights and they're not threatening people. So obviously, you can't do that. Even in America, there are still some restrictions on your freedom of speech that have been reformulated, or not reformulated, but they have been revised over time. But like we said a moment ago, just because you can vote doesn't mean your elections are democratic. So you have some authoritarian-based countries that have voting, but it's a sham. Like, for example, in Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro is not a democratically elected ruler of Venezuela. Technically, yes, he is, just because they had elections, but the elections were rigged. And unfortunately, there are quite a few countries that have similar situations. But that being said, there are common ideals of democracy that you do see in America, and the Bill of Rights is Exhibit A, especially when it comes to the First Amendment freedoms of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. Those are probably the most core parts of a democracy, particularly the free speech part. The consent of the governed, because you're talking about the rule by the people and power being vested in the people. You see that directly in the preamble of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to create a more perfect union, etc., etc. Right there is the consent of the governed. You can see it in the supreme law of the land right at the very beginning. Voting rights, we just talked about that. Of course, we unfortunately had very anti-democratic restrictions on that early on in American history, and it's taken a long time for those to be whittled down. Now we have racial minorities can vote, women can vote, the minimum people who don't have property can vote. The minimum age required to vote was lowered from 21 to 18 in the 1970s as a result of the Vietnam War, and especially with that sentiment that old enough to die, old enough to vote. So the argument was, if people can get drafted and they have to go off to die, then they should at least be able to vote. And that's another thing too. Drafts can be considered very anti-democratic because the people don't have a say in whether we have a draft. That's what you saw in World War II, World War I, Vietnam War, older wars. So that's another case of anti-democracy there. Protections against government intrusions are another ideal of democracy. For example, the protection against illegal searches and seizures in the Bill of Rights. The Declaration of Independence, the most well-known phrase from that is life, liberty, and a pursuit of happiness. And they were heavily influenced by one of the most particularly influential philosophers in that specific regard was John Locke and his philosophy about the right to personal property. And then minority rights. And this can be a bit of a tricky topic when it gets to democracy, because in its purest form, democracy doesn't really regard minority rights. It's simply just majority rule. And if you're in the minority, tough crap. You have to deal with it. And like we said before, founding fathers, or a lot of the founding fathers, not all of them had this worry, but a lot of them were weary of democracy for this very reason, calling it the tyranny of the majority. But then even people who are very supportive of democracy will oftentimes lament a minority being obstructive. You hear about it all the time in Congress, where people who support the majority party in power, whether it's Democrat, whether it's Republican, they'll say that the minority is being obstructive and purposely causing gridlock, even if they normally are very supportive of democracy. So then that gets into the, well, how much do you protect the right of minorities, and how much does it then, what's the dividing line where it then becomes just obstructionist? And there's no real easy answer in that regard, or whether the obstructionism is a threat to democracy. That is one of the many debates surrounding it. And then, of course, one of the biggest ideals of democracy is the idea of pluralism, where a whole bunch of interests can come and compete in a marketplace of ideas to have influence. Now, how pluralistic we are is another matter of debate. And actually, my guest next week we will be talking about pluralism in particular, and I will get her thoughts on the matter of hyperpluralism. So stay tuned for that. But pluralism, having a whole bunch of people competing for influence and trying to share their ideas, having that freedom of speech and petition and assembly and everything like that, that is another core aspect of democracy. So, how have Americans felt about democracy historically in America? Obviously, with voting rights having to be expanded over time, there are countless philosophical writings about the lack of democracy in America at different points in history, whether it's from racial minorities like a Frederick Douglass or a Thurgood Marshall, the first Black Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Frederick Douglass, a former slave, then eventually became freed and was one of the most influential thinkers of the Civil War era and the post-Civil War era. There have been a lot of instances of concerns about democracy at various points in time throughout history, especially from, well, including the founding fathers and their concerns about democracy. And even after the U.S. Constitution is ratified and several decades rolled on, some of those founding fathers and framers of the Constitution rethought what they felt about democracy. But some of the most obvious examples of people seeing U.S. democracy as, or Americans, or seeing the country coming up woefully short of its democratic ideals. Most obvious examples are slavery and Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws being the Reconstruction era and especially post-Reconstruction era laws that basically tried to recreate the environment and rules of slavery without actually reinstituting slavery. So technically they could say, oh, we're not actually putting African Americans in chains, but they're still heavily restricting all sorts of other things, like whether they can use the same facilities as white people or whether they can vote, and a lot of nefarious ways that they use to restrict the right to vote for African Americans, not the least of which was through sheer intimidation. But You had things like poll taxes. A lot of times, black voters were, in large part because of just coming out of slavery, very poor. And a lot of them worked as sharecroppers, for example. And so a lot of times they couldn't pay the poll tax to go and vote, or they couldn't pass literacy tests because they weren't allowed to be taught how to read and write as slaves, or at least they were very, very restricted in how they could do that. So there was a lot of ways that they weren't allowed to vote, even though they technically had the right to vote or could get themselves registered to vote. And another way that they got around that for white people, so there are still plenty of poor, illiterate white people then, but the way that a lot of these, especially southern states, got around that is they used something called a grandfather clause, where basically if your grandfather was allowed to vote, then you could get past all of those restrictions. So poor, illiterate white people wouldn't have to deal with poll taxes and literacy tests, at least not to the same degree that black people did. So obviously, that is very anti democratic. And then, of course, women not being able to vote, or at least not every American woman being able to vote until the 19th Amendment being ratified in 1920. You also had sedition laws. So the Alien and Sedition Acts during John Adams' presidency, that was a very controversial measure related to democracy, especially because they were particularly targeted to, it was a Federalist law that was targeted at Democratic Republicans. You had the Espionage Act during Woodrow Wilson's presidency in World War One, the draft in World War One, World War Two, Vietnam War. Those were certainly concerns about democracy as well, because people didn't have a say as to whether the draft was a legitimate means of, or that they didn't have any say as to whether the draft was, they had any consent to being drafted. Now, obviously, we don't have the draft anymore, but it technically could be reinstituted at some point in time, in which case then it would become another major concern about democracy if that happened. And then if we look at more quantitative measures of how people feel about democracy, Gallup has some polling on satisfaction with U.S. democracy, though they haven't done it consistently over time. They started it in 1984. They did some of the 1990s, and then they didn't do it again until the 2020s. There were some other polling organizations that did it, like CNN, for example. But just for the sake of consistency, we're just going to keep it with Gallup, because polling organizations can have differences in how they sample their populations or how exactly they word their questions, which can have a major impact on the results. So we'll just use Gallup for consistency. It'll be a little bit hard to paint a picture, but it kind of plummeted from the 1980s, or it went to the 1990s. It was okay. And then during the 1990s, it went down considerably. Up until the very end of the 1990s, it went up. And then in the 2020s, it went down. So specific numbers for people who were satisfied with the way U.S. democracy was working in the country, 61% agreed in 1984, and it went slightly down 60% in 1991, so there was a 7-year gap. Then it went to 48%, and then 36% in 1992, so they actually pulled it twice in 1992, and it shot down precipitously. 50% in 1994, then 46% in 1995. Then it went up a little bit, 52% in 1998. Then you get to the 2020s, and people do not feel good about democracy in America. There's 35% of people were satisfied with it in 2021. And then it hit its low point in 2023, which was 28%. And then last year it went up a little bit, 34% in 2024. Now, how do they feel about it in 2025? So, opinions on how democratic America is now can depend way too much on whether we support the party in power. If you're a Republican and the government is Republican, you probably think we're more democratic than Democrats do. And if it's a democratically controlled government or Democrat controlled government, you probably think the government is more democratic than lowercase d, than Republicans do. Unfortunately, our party affiliations color a lot about how we think about the level of democracy in this country, or how much we support a specific person, namely the president. So if we are the same party, yeah, democracy is working fine, or at least we tend to think that more. And if it's not the same party, then we tend to think, oh, democracy is under attack. Some people, though, regardless of that, they have accused the U.S. system of still not truly being democratic. Now, one prominent point of contention in that regard is the power of the wealthy, especially with the Citizens United case, the ruling from that by the U.S. Supreme Court, which enabled these independent expenditures that can spend unlimited amounts of money on elections. It was considered a matter of free speech for them, as long as these organizations don't coordinate with the campaigns they support. Now, if you do that, you will go to jail. But if these organizations don't directly coordinate with these campaigns, they are legally okay. That is a major point of controversy for a lot of people. And people see that as one of the examples of the wealthy having too much power in American politics. And then some activists would argue that voter ID laws are racist and therefore undemocratic. And they say they unfairly target racial minorities who have less access to those IDs that would be needed to vote. Now, I'm not saying that I agree or disagree with those sentiments. It's just examples I'm trying to bring up of people who say that we are not so democratic, or at least as democratic as we should be. And these are several of the reasons that they bring up. But for another quantitative measure of how people feel about democracy in America, there's a joint venture between the Kettering Foundation, which is involved with democracy initiatives around the globe, and Gallup, and it's called the Democracy for All Project. And they did this in-depth study of how Americans experience democracy. So like most polls, this has some positive and some negative takeaways for us to look at. And some of the positive takeaways: 80% of respondents agreed that political leaders should compromise with the other party to get things done, even if they don't like some parts of the compromise. 83% agreed that it is never okay for people to use violence to achieve a political goal, which you would hope that it was 100%, but of course, it's almost never 100%. But using political violence to achieve goals is inherently anti-democratic. A refusal to compromise is not necessarily anti-democratic, but refusing to hear out what other people have to say at any point in time, that is pretty anti-democratic. You're not really letting people put their voice out there. 84% agreed in this poll that the U.S. is stronger as a nation because it has people from different races, religions, and cultures. We talked about democracy. One of the big things is including more and more people in the process. So it is anti-democratic to exclude people based on race, religion, and culture. Bringing them in is more democratic. 83% of people in this poll agreed that wealthy individuals and businesses should be limited in how much they can advance political candidates or causes they support. Now, of course, how much you think they should be limited, that gets maybe a little bit murkier, and that might be more, there might be more specific debates about democracy when you talk about how exactly they should be restricted. 88% of people in the poll agreed that there are facts and there are opinions. Now, maybe that's not necessarily a democratic ideal. Well, you would hope that people are educated about how to tell when there's a fact and when there's an opinion. Unfortunately, though, as we've talked about several times on this podcast and has been talked about elsewhere plenty of times, is the ability of many people to tell the difference between a fact and an opinion is a little concerning. But you would hope, at least in a democracy, people know the difference and are willing to accept facts. And then lastly, the last positive takeaway that I'll bring up in this episode: large majorities of people supported compromise, the rejection of political violence, and multiculturalism regardless of age group, whether they graduated from college or not, and across party identifications. Fantastic. There's a lot of really good stuff there. Obviously, some of those things you'd like to see 100%, but once again, you're almost never going to get 100% in a poll on anything. However, I did say that there were some negative takeaways from this poll. And a few of the biggest ones here. Only 67% believe democracy is the best form of government. So while that is a large majority, and it's arguably still positive, I'd argue that we should see much more than 2/3 of Americans supporting it. Now, refer back to early in this episode, we talked about the technical definitions of democracy versus the ideals of democracy. So that could also be playing a role in here. There's when we ask people if democracy is the best form of government, and I'd have to go into the poll again to see the exact wording, but we're talking about democracy versus non-democracy, and we're still not sure if we support democracy as the better form of government. That is a bit concerning, but some people might be thinking of democracy versus a constitutional federal republic, like we just talked about how the US is by strict definition. Another concerning finding in the poll is that just 24% of the people that were surveyed are satisfied with the way democracy is working in the US. Dissatisfaction with various political barometers like this or others, like whether the country is quote unquote on the right track, unfortunately, they tend to be pretty low quite often. But just because it is a common sentiment doesn't mean that it's not concerning or that it's not something that we should address. It is something we need to address. 51% of the respondents rated U.S. democracy as performing poorly or very poorly. That is quite troubling. Obviously, we need to actually have democracy performing well, but it also is a big deal whether people think it is performing well. And then lastly, as Gallup writes, the data also revealed discord over how democracy should function, including how much power the majority should have, tolerance of radical voices in politics, and the pace of cultural change. People's political orientation, age, education, and in some cases, income are associated with deep societal divides over how to become a better union. So that speaks to the point about how we can disagree about specific policies, but we do need a unifying purpose. This trying to become the strongest union that we possibly could, bringing in as many voices as possible. But clearly, the Kettering/Gallup poll here shows a lot of divide in that regard. So, and that's not to say that I'm not trying to necessarily put forth my opinion about how much power the majority should have or specific voices that should get a seat at the table or anything. But the point is, these are serious concerns and things that we need to discuss so that we can make U.S. democracy the best it can be. Speaking of which, we do clearly have a lot of threats to democracy moving forward. Even without that poll, you can see threats to democracy. As I've said before, it's not just about whether our democratic ideals are objectively working. We have to feel that they are working too. Perception is oftentimes just as important as the reality. Otherwise, the legitimacy of these institutions is threatened. And so I'm going to talk about several of the biggest threats to democracy moving forward. And not that they're the only ones by any means, certainly not. But they are ones that we really have to think long and hard about how we're going to actually fix these points. Because if we don't fix these points, our democratic ideals are at stake. So, first one, and one I talk about a lot, of course, is political polarization, especially affective polarization. Affective relating to how we feel about people. So when we encounter people that think differently than us and we feel anger, hate, disgust, fear, that indicates higher levels of affective political polarization. And so when we have high rates of polarization, particularly affective polarization, it leads us to perceive threats to democracy conveniently only from people we don't agree with. We think that because these people think differently, that they're an existential threat to not only us, but what we think the US is supposed to be. And a lot of times it is purely based on the policies that we want, not that we actually think that they are threats to democracy. And this affective polarization leads us to hate and be angry with people who don't share our views. And so we start to be okay with trampling over their viewpoints. And this brings up the right of the minority. How much power should the majority have? Well, at some point, if you give them too much power, they're going to trample over minority viewpoints. And so it also leads us to believe that these quote unquote others don't belong. And this conflict over who belongs in our democracy is its own threat to democracy. We need to bring as many people as we possibly can in here, because this is not just my country. This is not just your country. This is our country. Another big threat to democracy moving forward is it's going to sound like two, but really they're both rolled into one, is the delegitimization of political institutions and the lack of public trust in institutions. There are a lot of people who profit off of dissension and anger, and they get a lot of social clout and make a lot of money off of making people angry about institutions, especially when they call into question election results simply because they lost. Now, before people make assumptions about who I'm talking about, this is something that both parties have done, and especially with the 2016 and 2020 elections. I try not to directly criticize people unless I think I can criticize across the board, and this is absolutely something that can be criticized. In 2016, Democrats, a lot of them did not want to believe that they legitimately lost the election, and Republicans told them to suck it up and quit crying. 2020 rolls around, and then Republicans say that the election results are illegitimate, and then Democrats tell them to suck it up and quit crying. We can't just accept election results when they're ones that we like. Doesn't mean that you can't criticize certain aspects about it, but when we just constantly talk about elections as being rigged because they didn't go the way we wanted them to, that is a very serious problem. And voting is just the most obvious of political institutions that we have. We have to believe that democratic institutions are legitimate and serious. But lately, people have been questioning them, not genuinely. Criticisms of institutions are fine because nothing is above reproach. We've seen through American history how that is the case, and things have had to be refined over time. And there are still plenty of things that need to be refined, but they have to be made with the right intentions in mind. If you're doing it purely just to gain social clout or to win elections, that is not a legitimate excuse. I mean, that should be obvious, but unfortunately it's not obvious. And public trust in government has cratered since the days of Eisenhower and JFK, where it was well into the majorities of people who thought that government, or they trusted government to do what is right just about always or most of the time. And with Pew Research Center data, we can look at 1958 through 2024, this polling about this very question. And Pew Research Center said they found that the percentage of people that they polled who say they trust government to do what is right just about always or most of the time was 24% in 2024. That is abysmal, and it hasn't been appreciably higher than that since the early 2000s. So even before that, when you saw public trust crater precipitously, it happened across both Democratic and Republican administration. So it's not a one party thing. And it doesn't help that public trust is also partially influenced by our party affiliation, where just like we think institutions are more legitimate when we happen to agree with the people who are running them, the general trust in government is largely influenced by whether we support the party in power. And that's not how it should be. That is a huge threat to democracy because then we think that only our opinions are the legitimate ones and that other opinions need to be stamped out, or otherwise they're going to stamp us out. It's this get them before they get you mentality that people have that really needs to change. Another threat to democracy going forward is economic inequality. This is not a point about capitalism versus socialism. I want to make that very clear right now. I'm not here to argue about what economic system is better. Just like anything else, they all have their flaws. I know we want to think that a lot of times our worldview is 100%. We've all been there. They're not. But I'm not arguing about which one is better. A lot of people on both sides want to make this argument about economic inequality a matter of politics because they're more concerned about winning political battles and arguments, not about actually fixing things. But that being said, undeniably, economic inequality has widened considerably over the decades. It was a major threat to democracy during the Gilded Age as well, which was the end of the 19th century. It was referring to the fact that on the surface, everything looked great. Economic expansion was happening and the overall economy was booming, but it covered up a lot of economic and political corruption at that time, hence the gilded part. It was a veneer. And so you have this economic inequality of these days as well. Now, how do you fix that? I'm not going to get into that because that is outside the purview of this discussion, and that is beside the point here. The point is economic inequality is a threat to democracy. Why is it an issue? A couple of the biggest reasons are when the non-wealthy have less and less capability of making their voice heard, as money interests drown them out, you start to push out a lot of those viewpoints and you don't bring in as many people to make their voice heard, which is anti-democratic to shut out those opinions, even if you're not intending to do that. And not only that, but voters just become preoccupied with their immediate economic concerns, like feeding their families, working long shifts, to even think about and research political institutions or issues, and will often just sit out elections. They just throw their hands up in frustration. They say, you know what, nobody's working for me, so I'm just not going to deal with it, which is another threat to democracy. This voter apathy and lack of participation in elections when people are not making their voice heard, and not necessarily because they're being prevented from doing so, but they feel like there's no point or they just don't care. We have a serious problem, and I will refer back to my episode 50 about voter apathy. And then one of my guests I had on here, Shaka Mitchell, we talked about voter apathy further and how to potentially fix that as well. But if people don't care, then certain interests that are not as concerned about democracy are going to squeeze out other people's opinions. And if we're only having a small percentage, or not necessarily a small percentage, but you're only having a percentage of people participating in the process when a whole lot more can participate, you're not getting a really representative government. You're not really having everybody's voice be heard. And I would encourage you to look into that episode some more as well. And I hope to do more projects about political apathy as well. But it is a very serious problem we have facing democracy if we don't get more people to care about what's happening, regardless of what their actual opinions are. We need more people to pay attention and to get invested. And then the last point I want to cover about the threat to democracy is we have a very serious issue with worshiping political candidates. We've gradually seen more and more cults of personality around candidates of all political stripes. Republicans, Democrats, independents, conservatives, liberals, moderates, fascists, communists, socialists, anarchists, whatever the case may be. And our support of these specific figures, not just the parties, but of specific figures, becomes a core part of our identity. And so when someone criticizes these particular people, we see it as a threat to ourselves. Like, oh, they're not just attacking this person I really support, they're attacking me. That is a very serious blurring of the lines between the simple support of a candidate and praise of a candidate. Supporting candidates, that's perfectly fine. That's making your voice heard. We all have people that we support. But when you start to become fans of people that are in politics, I think that's a very serious issue that we have on our hands. It should never get to a point where you're treating it like sports. You have a favorite team, you have a favorite athlete, and I mean, in the context of sports, that can also obviously get way overboard too. But at least there, ultimately, what happens in sports doesn't truly matter in the grand scheme of things. And it can actually be fun in that regard. That's not the case with politics. This is not something that we should be treating like a sport where we are fans of somebody, fans of a brand, whether as a person or a party, but especially in this case, at least, when I say specific individual. We should not be fans of somebody. I don't care who it is. I don't care if it's me. I really appreciate the support that you give by tuning in and liking and commenting and sharing. But I hope I never get to that point where there's a cult of personality around me, because then that can also, I don't want that to get to my head. And that's another thing, is not just for the people who are becoming worshipers of candidates, the people who are being worshipped, who have a fandom around them, they start to think, oh, you know what? I'm pretty cool. I'm pretty great. I don't need to listen to other people. It does get to people's heads. There's countless examples of that. And they may not have been so conceited before, but you get enough adoration and people that are not willing to hold you accountable, you start to think you can slide with a lot more, and that you're not, that people aren't going to say anything, or that you can still achieve your ultimate goals. And that's not a point we should ever get to. Because when you're a fan of somebody or something, you tend to be a lot less critical of it. Or you might be critical within your chosen circles, but never with the quote unquote outside, the other side. You're never going to be critical of your team or your person in the midst of other people, which is its own issue. But just like institutions are not above criticism, neither are people, arguably even more so. When we start to treat people, specific people, as the only cure to the ills of government and society, and we unthinkingly support everything they do, that's when you start to see those people try to erode democratic ideals, because they start to believe that they're above reproach and that they don't need to hear other people's beliefs. And that is one of the, I have a lot of concerns about politics in this country, and that is one of the greatest, is these cults of personality that we see, that I think we've seen a lot more of in more recent years. And I would ask people to, if you start to feel yourself being a little too unthinkingly supportive of somebody, if you think you're a fan of somebody, I'd ask you to take a step back and think about, am I going too far with this? Support is fine. Being a fan, I'd argue, is not. So some things to think about as we move forward with these democratic ideals that we need to uphold. Now, of course, we do have, or we need to have, discussions about how to preserve them, and what point is going too far and what point is not going far enough. Those should be conversations to have, and how we improve things, because we should always be striving to improve. But when you're sowing distrust in specific people and institutions because you're trying to win political battles and arguments, that is a threat to democracy. So some things to leave you with, to think about, but that is going to wrap things up for today's episode. Been quite a while since I've done an episode just by myself. It was kind of neat, but I, of course, always enjoy having actual guests on, and I'm going to have a guest on next week, as I mentioned earlier, with pluralism. So you'll see her on the next episode. But anyways, thank you so much for listening and watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and share with all the people you know this podcast. My links are in the show notes, my Facebook, my LinkedIn profile, my medium.com profile I write on from time to time, my 5-day educational email course you can sign up for, just 5 days of the 5 biggest mistakes made when we try to depolarize politics that can accidentally actually make polarization worse. My email and my website, paulrader.org. My email is paulraderwrites@gmail.com. That is it for today. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.